Whose car is this really? The question sliced through the crisp morning air so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even the distant hum of traffic outside the federal courthouse seemed to fade beneath the weight of those 6 words. Officer Brandon Hayes stood beside a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class parked along the curb, one hand resting near his duty belt, his posture stiff with certainty. In front of him stood a black man in a charcoal gray overcoat, his expression calm despite the attention gathering around them. The courthouse plaza was already busy. Lawyers carrying leather briefcases crossed the wide stone steps. Reporters adjusted cameras near the entrance. Government employees hurried through the revolving doors before the start of another long day. Yet now, all eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding beside the luxury sedan. Brandon looked the man up and down. The coat was clean but not expensive. The shoes showed signs of wear along the edges. A weathered leather briefcase hung from one hand, its corners softened by years of use. Nothing about him looked remarkable. Nothing about him seemed to match the 6-figure vehicle parked beside him. "I asked you a question," Brandon said, his voice louder this time. "Whose car is this?" The man met his gaze without irritation, without fear, without the defensiveness Brandon had come to expect. "It belongs to me, officer," he replied. His voice was steady, low, controlled. "Registered in my name." A faint murmur rolled through the growing crowd. Brandon's jaw tightened. He had been patrolling downtown for nearly 8 years. He trusted his instincts. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that something about this situation did not add up. "Registration and ID," Brandon said. The man nodded politely. "Of course." He opened his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Brandon glanced down briefly before looking back up. Elijah Carter. The name meant nothing to him. Just another citizen. Just another face in a city of millions. Around them, phones slowly appeared. People pretended not to stare while doing exactly that. A young reporter near the courthouse steps subtly angled her camera toward the interaction. The marble facade behind them reflected the morning sunlight, throwing bright flashes across the plaza. Brandon examined the license again. The address belonged to one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Washington. He almost laughed. "That your house too?" he asked. Elijah simply nodded. "Yes, sir." The answer should have settled the matter. Instead, it seemed to irritate Brandon even more. Something about Elijah's calmness felt wrong to him. Most people became nervous under scrutiny. Most people rushed to prove themselves. Elijah did neither. He stood quietly beneath the cool November sunlight, one hand resting on the handle of his briefcase, his breathing slow and even. It was as if he had nowhere else to be, as if none of this bothered him. Brandon looked toward the courthouse entrance. Security personnel moved through the front lobby beyond the glass doors. A convoy of black SUVs had not yet arrived, but preparations were already underway for some high-level government proceeding. The entire area carried the tense energy of an important day. "Mind telling me what brings you here?" Brandon asked. "I have a hearing this morning." "A hearing?" Brandon repeated. "That right?" "Yes." Elijah's answer remained simple. No explanation. No attempt to impress. No mention of titles or accomplishments. Just the truth delivered without decoration. Brandon folded his arms. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. The courthouse clock struck 9. The sound echoed across the plaza like a warning bell. Somewhere behind the glass entrance, a set of doors opened. Several officials stepped outside and scanned the street. Elijah glanced briefly toward them before returning his attention to Brandon. The movement lasted less than a second, but something about it caught Brandon's attention. The officials appeared to be looking for someone. Someone important. Someone late. Yet Elijah remained standing exactly where he was, calm beneath dozens of watching eyes, while the officers near the courthouse exchanged increasingly concerned looks. And for the first time that morning, a faint shadow of uncertainty crossed Brandon Hayes' face. The uncertainty vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Brandon straightened his shoulders and pushed the feeling aside. Experience had taught him that hesitation could make an officer look weak, and he had spent years building a reputation for confidence. Across the plaza, people continued moving around the scene while pretending not to watch. The cold November breeze swept between the courthouse columns, carrying the scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cart. Elijah Carter stood quietly beside the Mercedes, his gray overcoat shifting slightly in the wind. He looked less like a wealthy executive and more like a retired teacher waiting for a bus. That was what confused Brandon most. The vehicle, the address on the license, the calm demeanor, none of it seemed to fit together. Elijah noticed the officer studying him again and offered a small, polite smile. It was not defensive. It was not sarcastic. If anything, it carried the patience of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Brandon looked away first. He hated that realization. A television crew was setting up across the street. Their equipment reflected flashes of sunlight onto the courthouse windows. A group of law students gathered near the entrance, whispering among themselves while occasionally glancing toward the interaction. Elijah had become the center of attention without doing anything at all, yet he seemed completely unaffected by it. The leather briefcase remained tucked beneath his arm. Its surface showed years of use. Small scratches lined the corners. The brass clasp had faded from gold to bronze. Whatever story the briefcase carried, it had traveled many miles. Brandon nodded toward it. "What is in there?" Elijah glanced down. "Documents. Important documents." "I would say so." The answer was simple enough, but something about it irritated Brandon. Every response from Elijah felt measured, thoughtful, respectful. There was no attitude to challenge, no argument to win, no mistake to expose, just quiet certainty. For a brief moment, Brandon wondered what kind of hearing required someone to arrive this early. Most federal proceedings were routine, yet the activity around the courthouse suggested otherwise. Security personnel spoke into earpieces. Vehicles entered restricted areas. Staff members checked watches and exchanged concerned looks. Someone important had not arrived. One of the courthouse administrators stepped outside and scanned the crowd again. His gaze moved past dozens of people before briefly landing on Elijah. The man immediately started walking in their direction. Brandon noticed it. So did several others nearby. The administrator looked relieved, almost excited. Then his phone rang. He stopped, answered quickly, and after listening for several seconds, turned away and hurried back toward the building. The strange moment left Brandon with more questions than answers. Elijah simply watched him leave. "Looks like somebody is having a stressful morning," Elijah said. Brandon frowned. "You seem awfully relaxed for someone being questioned outside a federal courthouse." Elijah looked toward the American flag waving above the entrance. The bright red and white stripes moved against a cloudless blue sky. "Life teaches you what deserves worry and what does not," he said quietly. The words lingered in the air. Nearby conversations softened. Even people pretending not to listen seemed drawn toward the exchange. Brandon folded his arms again. He could not explain why, but every minute that passed made him feel less certain of his first impression. Yet instead of reconsidering, he doubled down. Pride had a way of doing that. Across the street, the sound of approaching engines echoed through downtown Washington. Several heads turned at once. Dark vehicles were entering the block. The courthouse security team immediately became alert. And for the first time that morning, Elijah Carter checked his watch. The approaching convoy rolled into view with quiet precision, a line of dark sport utility vehicles gliding down the street like shadows against the bright morning sun. Almost instantly, courthouse security shifted positions. Earpieces crackled. Uniformed personnel exchanged quick glances. The atmosphere changed. People who had been casually walking moments earlier slowed down to watch. Brandon Hayes noticed it immediately. Whatever was happening inside the courthouse, it clearly mattered. He looked toward the vehicles and then back at Elijah Carter. The older man had lowered his wrist after checking his watch, his expression unchanged. Calm, patient, almost as if he had expected the convoy to arrive at that exact moment. Brandon narrowed his eyes. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. Elijah smiled faintly. "You could say that." The answer only deepened Brandon's suspicion. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. A woman carrying a stack of legal files stopped near the courthouse fountain. Two interns paused halfway up the steps. Even a pair of reporters who had been focused on another story now pointed their cameras toward the plaza. The scene had become impossible to ignore. Brandon shifted his weight. This morning already carried enough pressure. What nobody standing nearby knew was that he had barely slept the night before. In less than an hour, a federal review board would begin examining a complaint filed against him months earlier. The investigation had followed him everywhere. Every shift, every report, every conversation with his supervisors. Officially, he remained on active duty. Unofficially, Everyone knew his career hung in the balance. Brandon had convinced himself the hearing would go his way. He always had. Confidence had carried him through difficult situations before. Yet as the convoy approached, an uncomfortable feeling settled into his chest. He could not explain why. Across the street, the lead vehicle came to a stop. Security personnel stepped out first. Their dark suits contrasted sharply with the pale stone of the courthouse. One of them spoke into a microphone hidden near his collar. Another scanned the crowd carefully. Brandon watched their movements. They were not searching randomly. They were looking for someone specific. The realization made him glance back toward Elijah. The older man stood quietly beside the Mercedes, fingers resting lightly on the worn handle of his briefcase. Nothing about his posture suggested anxiety. If anything, he looked completely at ease. A gust of wind swept through the plaza. Fallen leaves skittered across the pavement. The American flag above the courthouse snapped sharply against the blue sky. For a moment, everything seemed strangely still. Then one of the suited agents spotted Elijah. The man's expression changed instantly. Relief flashed across his face. He spoke into his earpiece and pointed toward the curb. Several other agents turned in the same direction. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. The crowd noticed it too. Conversation stopped. Cameras lifted higher. The suited agents began walking toward them with purpose, weaving through clusters of spectators. Their pace was not hurried, but it was deliberate. Brandon straightened instinctively. Beside him, Elijah simply adjusted his overcoat and looked toward the courthouse entrance. The morning sunlight reflected softly from the lenses of his glasses. For the first time since the encounter began, Brandon realized he might not understand the situation at all. And as the agents drew closer with every step, that realization became harder to ignore. The agents were less than 20 feet away when Brandon lifted a hand. "Hold on," he said, stepping slightly forward. The words came out firmer than he intended. The suited men slowed but did not stop. Their attention remained fixed on Elijah. That alone made Brandon uneasy. He glanced back at the older man. "Before anybody goes anywhere, I still have questions." Elijah nodded calmly. "You are welcome to ask them." The response carried no challenge, no frustration, and somehow that made the situation feel even stranger. Most people would have been eager to leave. Most people would have seized the opportunity to walk away the moment federal agents appeared. Elijah did neither. He simply remained beside the Mercedes, patient as ever. Brandon looked down at the registration once more. Everything matched. The vehicle belonged to Elijah Carter. The address was valid. The identification was valid. Every piece of information in front of him supported the same conclusion. Yet something inside Brandon refused to let go of the story he had already created in his head. Around them, phones continued recording. The crowd had nearly doubled in size. Reporters whispered into microphones. Courthouse employees lingered near the steps pretending to check messages while secretly watching every second unfold. The entire plaza felt suspended between curiosity and anticipation. One of the agents finally spoke. "Sir, we need to escort Mr. Carter inside." Brandon turned toward him. "For what purpose?" The agent exchanged a brief glance with a colleague. "That information is not yours to discuss." The answer landed like a stone in Brandon's chest. His jaw tightened. He hated being left out of the loop, especially in front of a crowd, especially on a morning when his own future felt uncertain. He looked back toward Elijah. "You said you have a hearing." "Yes." "What kind of hearing?" Elijah adjusted his grip on the old briefcase. The leather creaked softly. "An important one." A few people nearby exchanged amused looks. The answer was technically truthful and completely unhelpful. Brandon felt heat rising into his face. The courthouse clock above the entrance showed 9:10. Every passing minute brought him closer to his own review proceeding. Yet somehow he remained standing here arguing with a man who refused to become rattled. The contrast bothered him more than he cared to admit. A young law student standing near the fountain leaned toward her friend and whispered something. They both glanced at Elijah with visible respect. Brandon noticed. Others were beginning to notice as well. The agents, the courthouse staff, even strangers passing through the plaza seemed to recognize something about the older man that he did not. The realization irritated him. "Look," Brandon said, crossing his arms. "People do not usually arrive at a federal courthouse with an escort detail waiting for them." Elijah smiled slightly. "Today is not a usual day." The answer lingered in the cold morning air. Behind them, the convoy remained parked along the curb. Engines idled quietly. Security personnel maintained their positions. No one appeared impatient. No one appeared surprised. It was almost as though the entire operation had been prepared around one person. One person who stood quietly beside a black Mercedes with a worn briefcase and a calm expression. Then another suited official emerged from the courthouse doors. The moment he stepped outside and spotted Elijah, relief spread across his face. He immediately started walking toward them at a brisk pace. And this time, there was no mistaking who he had come to meet. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, washing the marble floors in gold. Most of the crowd from that morning was gone now. Reporters had packed their equipment. Lawyers hurried home. The tension that had gripped the building for hours had finally faded into a quiet hum. Brandon Hayes stepped out through the front doors carrying a thin folder beneath his arm. The review board had reached its decision. He would keep his badge, not because his mistakes had been ignored, but because he had accepted responsibility for them. Mandatory training, additional supervision, a formal warning placed in his record. The outcome could have been far worse. Yet what stayed with him was not the decision itself. It was the reason behind it. As he descended the courthouse steps, he spotted a familiar black Mercedes parked near the curb. Elijah Carter stood beside it, speaking with a courthouse employee. The conversation ended with a handshake and a smile. Then Elijah turned and noticed Brandon standing there. For a moment, neither man spoke. The cool evening breeze carried a few fallen leaves across the stone plaza. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed across the city. Brandon walked forward slowly. The folder felt heavier than it should have. "Sir," he said. Elijah smiled gently. "Officer Hayes." Brandon looked down before meeting his eyes again. "I wanted to thank you." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "For what?" Brandon exhaled. "For being fair." The older man studied him quietly. The same calm expression remained on his face, unchanged from the first moment they had met. "Fairness is not something we give people," Elijah said. "It is something we owe them." The words settled between them. Simple, honest, difficult to forget. Brandon nodded slowly. He understood now. That morning he had looked at a man and decided who he was before learning anything about him. He had trusted assumptions instead of facts, pride instead of patience. The lesson had cost him more than embarrassment. It had forced him to confront parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. Elijah opened the rear door of the Mercedes. Then he paused. "Officer Hayes." Brandon looked up. "Yes, sir." Elijah glanced toward the courthouse behind them. The evening sun reflected from the glass entrance, turning the entire building into a mirror of gold and light. The law works best when the people enforcing it remember the humanity of the people standing in front of them. Brandon swallowed hard and nodded. "I will remember that." Elijah smiled once more. "I believe you will." He stepped into the vehicle. The door closed softly. A moment later, the Mercedes pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of Washington traffic. Brandon remained standing on the courthouse steps. The city moved around him. Cars passed. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued exactly as it had before. Yet something inside him felt different. Above the courthouse entrance, the American flag moved gently in the evening wind. Brandon watched it for a long moment. Then he adjusted his uniform, picked up the folder beneath his arm, and started down the steps. No cameras followed him. No crowd watched him leave. There was only the fading sunlight, the sound of distant traffic, and the quiet realization that real justice often begins long before a courtroom and long after a verdict. And as the last light of day stretched across the marble plaza, the silence felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of a better man.